All right, we're back here on the Chase Thomas podcast, where I am now joined by someone that I have listened to, read, I won't say watched, Jay, unfortunately, because I am not old enough. I am not old enough to have watched you growing up, but I've seen clips, and, you know, you're pretty good. I must say, Jay Bilas, you're pretty good back in the day, but I am so grateful that you made the time to come on this very podcast this evening. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
With how early you get up and how early those tweets go out, what time are you going to bed these days, Jay? What time are you in the rack?
It depends on the night.
Okay.
But I'm usually during the season, just after midnight. But it depends on what off season, what I'm watching on Netflix or something that puts me to sleep. But yeah, I'm around midnight usually.
What are you watching on Netflix right now? Is there anything specific? Are you a big Ozark guy?
I've finished the first half of the last season of Ozark.
What'd you think?
And then I like it, but I was convinced that I didn't know that was the first half of the season. They fooled me on that. I thought, okay, well, my God, what a bummer that is. That ending.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of looking forward to that. And then I just finished season 5 of Better Call Saul, which I liked. I was a Breaking Bad guy, so
Yeah.
Better Call Saul was very good.
I think the final 7 episodes for Ozark come out this week. I think it's this weekend. I want to say.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I think the final 7. So I don't know what your schedule looks like the rest of the week, Jay, but you might want to go ahead and prioritize 7 hours for binging Ozark, because I feel like the spoilers are going to be rampant. Like, I'm going to stay off Twitter for the weekend. I mean, it's a good idea to stay off Twitter anyway. I think it's a good daily advice, but especially when there's something you want to watch, because it's so easy to find those spoilers. My first question to you, Jay, now that you've had a few weeks to think about it, the NCAA tournament has wrapped up. Were you surprised, after everything that was said and done, that Kansas were the 2022 champions?
Well, I mean, if you would have told me in February they were going to win it, I would have said, well, I wouldn't favor them. I would have favored other teams ahead of them. But once I saw the bracket, actually Kansas was the only team that I got right out of my Final Four. And then when both Duke and North Carolina made the semifinal and so much attention went to them, I think I said on multiple platforms that I wouldn't mind being Kansas right now. Let the Hatfields and McCoys fight it out, and if they want to go to overtime, knock yourself out, then Kansas will play them on Monday night. It's sort of a bummer for Villanova that they lost Justin Moore in the regional final against Houston, because that really compromised their ability to really contend for it. But it was a great Final Four on a number of fronts. The teams were very good, obviously, and the quality of play overall was good. But I think the thing that made it seem like it was an all-timer was the fact that we had fans back for the first time, and it seemed normal. And it's been a long time since I think we felt normal from, I don't know what it was, maybe February on. It felt pretty normal. There were times in January you're worried about things, and you're walking around and everybody's masked up, and it was better than it had been. But it was still compromised, and but there was in New Orleans a real feeling of normalcy, which was kind of nice.
Do you like that they're playing Final Four games now in football stadiums? Do you like that feel? And do you think players are used to it at this point, or do you think it actually does take some time for them to get used to playing in a football arena versus a basketball arena?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's way better than it used to be. They've done a great job with the sight lines. So when you're actually on the floor, it doesn't feel as cavernous as it used to. So the sight lines for shooting are great, and that they figured out. The size, I mean, look, I've been high up with some of our broadcast positions for studio stuff, and there's no way that the people in the upper deck can even see the game. I don't even know why they're there, honestly. But for the players, I mean, every time the players walk out of the floor, they're looking around like they can't believe how big this thing is. I don't think it really matters. I mean, it's easy to understand why they do it in those big arenas. It's money.
Yeah.
And they don't want to play in a 25,000 seat arena, which is plenty big. Most players don't play in that big of an arena during the regular season, but it's all for money. And look, I like money as much as the next guy. I don't have a problem with it, but it's hard to it's hard to say this isn't pro sports when you see, the way this whole thing's monetized, but it's all good. I mean, I thought it was a great atmosphere, and there's certain cities that the Final Four is just better in, and New Orleans is one of those, along with San Antonio. I still think Indianapolis is pretty good,
Hmm.
but I'm a big New Orleans San Antonio fan for a lot of I've been to a bunch of Final Fours over the years, and I heard somebody say once, like, the best thing about the Final Four is you see everybody you know, and the
Mhm.
worst thing about the Final Four is you see everybody you know, uh, which I thought was kind of funny.
Are you more of an extrovert? Or are you more of an introvert? Like when you see a lot of people out and people are like, "Oh, that's Jay Bilas," and like you said, when you're out, like do you get energized by those interactions, or are you someone who just you're just like, because this is how I am with being an introvert. Like I don't know. There's this like misconception when it comes to people who do broadcasting for a living, and they think, oh, extrovert to do this kind of thing, but it's not really true. Like the majority of my time is reading, and just I'm far more comfortable in and just being independent. Is that how you are, or do you enjoy that kind of just running into everybody all the time?
I enjoy it. I
Okay.
mean, I guess I'd classify myself as more of an extrovert,
Hmm.
and I really enjoy meeting people, and the fact that I've been lucky enough to have this sort of ESPN platform where people know who you are, and they're more likely to come up and say hello or strike up a conversation. That actually is helpful.
Hmm.
To me, it's a nice icebreaker, and I wind up meeting more people that way, and most every interaction you have with people are great. I mean, occasionally that you're walking down the street and people shout something out. Sometimes you don't know, even if they just say Jay, that's a Jay, go Wildcats or whatever. Sometimes you don't know exactly how to respond to some of that stuff, and
Mm.
I have to be a little careful with that because
Hmm.
you never know what people mean by certain things they say. But 99% of the interactions I have with people are awesome, and whether it's in an airport or a restaurant or walking down the street, people want to have a picture or something. I always, unless I got to catch a plane or something, I mean,
Mm.
I'm always happy to do it because it's not. People are usually so nice, and I've met a lot of really really nice people that we may have a connection. You talk to them, you find out, similar people or the same people. It's really really kind of a fun thing for me.
Is there one thing from the tournament that you're still thinking about, like maybe just a certain style of play that you saw that you just, or a game, if it goes differently, you think the whole tournament goes differently? Was there one player and his performance that has made you rethink where they can go? Is there one thing in particular that you've been thinking about a lot since the tournament ended?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think what North Carolina did in the tournament was really, really interesting. I mean, I would not have given you a nickel for the chances of Carolina in December or January, and
Mm.
then you could see them getting better and better throughout February, and say, hey, they're dangerous. But you're not sure. Like I wasn't thinking Final Four for them even then. Probably until they beat Duke at Duke, you're going, man. They play like this, they can beat anybody. And they got tougher. They were guarding, and Hubert Davis was so positive with his team throughout the whole year. When other coaches, I think, would have been down on their team, he was positive with them. And then I was struck by the fact that everybody's coming back,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't it hasn't really been the norm in the past several years. And I don't know how much their experience. Obviously, their experience was good, and they want to come back and duplicate it. But you don't know how much like the NIL sphere has helped in that. Whether players are more likely to stay. It seems like we have more players staying now, even though there are a whole
Mm-hmm.
bunch that are testing the waters and going into the draft process like normal. It just seems like there are more big name players that have decided to come back, and I can't see that anything but a positive for the game. People talk about, well, I don't know as many of the players as I used to,
Mm-hmm.
back in the day when I was playing, when everybody stayed because there wasn't enough money in the game to leave. Now there is, and but you'd think those people would be celebrating the fact that all these players are coming back because there'll be more known commodities and more older players next year.
Yeah, I am curious because Kennedy Chandler and like I'm a Tennessee guy and I'm here in graduate school at UT, and that was a name that I was just so curious about because Keon obviously goes last year one and done, and he's on team number two, 2 years guaranteed, making about 2 mil in the NBA. He's with the Blazers now, and Kennedy is gonna be around that spot. He's not a lottery pick, but he's right on that fringe where Keon was last year, and you saw just like how much this team and this tournament meant to him. And we all think about the embrace that him and Juwan Howard had after that loss that we don't have to get into at all. We don't have to talk Michigan, Tennessee at all. But it was something where I was like, I wonder if he's the first like big piece where it's like, oh, if I come back, because there is not a lot of guard depth coming back at UT, PJ Edwards might have a big role this upcoming year as a true freshman, and I'm curious to see how Barnes handles the guard rotation, especially early on. But like, I mean, Tennessee could come up with 2 million for NIL for a year. We just saw with Oscar Shibwe getting the 2 million or so around that to return to Kentucky. And I understand it's different being a late second round draft guy versus a late first. But if the money is close, I wonder if we start to see more of those guys who are on the fringe lottery stay versus the second round. I don't know. Do you think that's coming? Because you kind of touched on NIL a little bit, but guys like Kennedy who are on the fringe where it's like, if the money's close, why not come back for one more year?
Yeah, I think we're more likely to see that, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a good thing. And people may call this, kind of corny or Pollyanna, whatever. But if we really do believe that education is a priority and a good thing for a young person, why wouldn't we celebrate the fact that a player decided to come back, even if money was a factor in doing it,
Mm-hmm.
because they get another year of education and maturity and all these things we say we value. The NIL space has been interesting to me because, look, I've been an advocate for players being able to bargain for their fair market value along with everybody else. They're the only ones that haven't been able to do it in our society, but especially in big time sports. And, to me, it's not a big deal. To others, it seems like it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I just don't see why this is such a problem. It's new, so it's a little bit different for people, but it shows like all the things that have been said over the years about, well, only 2% of the players go pro, which isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
It's only true if you factor in Division two, Division three, and NAIA, all that stuff. So you cast a wide enough. It's like saying only a select few go from high school to college. I mean, a ton
Right.
of players go from high school to college. But if you take every schlep that plays high school basketball and count them,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like a tiny number, but it's really not. So, for me, I think it's nothing but a good thing. It's just, people go, well, there are no guardrails, there are no rule. Well, there are no guardrails for what coaches get paid or what people
Right.
spend on facilities or travel or all these other things. But we have to have a guardrail for players. I don't buy that, but I understand the concern. But if it means that players stay in school longer, we all think that's a good. We thought it was a good thing before NIL. I don't see why we would think it's a bad thing with NIL.
What is Villanova losing in Jay Wright?
Well, I mean, they're losing not only an iconic coach, but they're losing a touchstone and one of the truly great people and leaders that the game has known. And it's certainly that the game's known in my time in it, in the last, since the early '80s when I became a college player. I can count on one hand the coaches that I think are in that class, and Jay Wright's in that class. He's one of the greatest ever. And when you balance out all the things that we would say we value in a leader, integrity, consistency, character, competence, humility, all these things, Jay Wright checks every box, and he's unbelievably nice and accommodating to everybody he deals with, and treats everyone. I mean, he's a walking masterclass on how to treat people,
Hmm.
and that which I think shows you can be incredibly competitive and a nice person at the same time. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. That one, it surprised me when I found out last Wednesday that he was retiring. And honestly, it hurt a little bit. It's one of
Mm-hmm.
those things that felt like kind of a gut punch to the game. But that's more of a selfish reaction that, I've enjoyed interacting with him in the game. He's been one of the guys I've valued most that I've been around and covered and gotten to know and become friends with. But that's the selfish side. I really do honestly feel good for him that
Mm-hmm.
he's making this decision with his wife Patty. That it's forward looking. It's not I'm walking away from something. And I mean, I think he got emotional about it because he loves it so much. But I really believe he's so genuine and authentic in how he goes about things and how he explained it. That there's a part of me that's happy for him that he's doing something that he feels he should do, rather than being in a position. And it's hard to imagine him being in this position, but so many coaches wind up in it where toward the end, you feel like you lost your fastball or you're being pushed or, you're not on top of your game. He's kind of doing a Jim Brown, Sandy Koufax type deal of walking away while he's at the top of his game. And you don't see that very often.
Do you have a favorite hire from this coaching cycle? Do you have one that you just circled? You're like, oh, this is, I think, going to be a home run situation for both sides.
Ugh. I mean, I'm sure there are a bunch of them. I haven't really cataloged all that stuff. I mean, I know Billy Taylor just got hired at Elon. I think he's
Mm.
going to do a great job there. I mean, that's not one of the high profile hires. I'll be interested to see. I think Mike White going to Georgia is going to do a really good job.
Hmm.
It's a big build there, and I think they have to put a lot into basketball. Um, it's a great football school, but it's not traditionally been a great basketball school. But I'm a big believer in Mike White and his ability level. But yeah, there are a bunch of new coaches. I mean, the SEC it seems like really turned over. But there's not one that stands out. Like last year when Hubert Davis got hired at North Carolina, I really did believe that was a home run. Did I think he'd be in the Final Four his first year? I can't tell you that, but
Hmm.
I knew he was the real deal.
Interesting. I'll have one more UNC thing in just a second, but um, from your perspective, as I think you see the game in such a different, unique way, that I wanted to ask, like when I'm watching film or I'm watching teams, I can tell you what Tennessee's running and the kind of stuff that they're throwing at people. But from your perspective this year, who did you find ran the most interesting sets? Who did you enjoy watching the most? That like, oh, this is some really interesting offensive just sets that they run consistently, and that you were like, oh, this is different. This is pretty interesting. Did you have a team who did that more than anybody?
Yeah, North Carolina was at the top of that
Hmm.
list because they played so differently this year as opposed to last year. They've always been, especially under Roy Williams, a two traditional low post, two low post guys, and they ran a lot of box sets. They ran their secondary break, and I think one thing about North Carolina in the past is they were the easiest scout in the country. You knew
Hmm.
exactly what was coming. The problem was you couldn't stop it,
Right.
and they ran with they ran everything with such pace that they could wear you down, foul you out, that kind of stuff. And because they ran it with such pace, it was so difficult to deal with. Um, so when Hubert Davis came in, it was a vastly different way to play. They were a lot of spread offense, multiple ball screen, um, and had a stretch four and Brady Manick, which they had not had there before.
Hmm.
They had four men that could step away and shoot, but not where it's their leading 3-point shooter like Manick was, and they became more of a 3-point shooting team. Then still wound up rebounding. I've always been a fan of the way Villanova has played, even though it's not necessarily, you're diagramming all their set plays. It's more the fact it's like the old Chuck Daly thing, spacing his offense, and they would space so well off of drives, their back downs, 2-footed jump stops, and pivoting, and then space off that, kick it, and then shot fake and drive again. And I was talking to, I think it was Alex O'Connell at the Slam Dunk 3-point, and he had played at Duke and got to know him a little bit. When he went to Creighton, I was asking him about Villanova, And he kind of shook his head. He said, "Man, you can talk about guarding them all you want to, but he said it's different when you have to actually do it. That stay down on their fakes, do this, do that." He goes, "They're going to get you at some point because they're so disciplined. They keep doing it over and over and over again." And so I've always been a big fan of the way they play. It's not a fast-paced thing; it's
Hmm.
more of a slower game. And I don't think they play a similar pace to Virginia, but people criticize Virginia for playing so slow, and they don't seem to be as critical of Villanova. But it's and man, that you go to their practices, and I'm sure you do. I'm always mesmerized by it. That's a team full of men, and they're incredibly well trained.
Do you think there's any drop off, or the fact that there is a lot of continuity with the coaching hire and with the coaching change? That obviously he was a lead assistant at Nova and knows Jay Wright well, and was only at Fordham for 1 year. But do you see a lot of changes like what you saw with Hubert Davis from Roy Williams, or do you think it will be a lot more familiarity and they won't drastically change how they play?
I don't know. That's a good question. What you hope for is that Kyle Neptune is as authentically himself as Jay Wright was.
Mm-hmm.
That just because Jay did it a certain way doesn't mean that Kyle needs to do everything the same way. I mean, I think they want to keep the pillars of their program the same because they're amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean they have to run all the same stuff and all the same out of bounds plays and all that stuff. If they change anything, the Villanova fans will go nuts. I don't think they will.
Mm-hmm.
But you just hope that, and Kyle's been a head coach, so it's not like this is his first rodeo. But I think there's a tendency to believe that, hey, you gotta keep things similar and all that. All you really have to do is win,
Mm-hmm.
and people are going to like what you do. And that's easy to say and hard to do. But I hope that, and I'm sure they will, because Villanova fans are great.
Mm-hmm.
But I hope they just let Kyle be himself, and because being him is more than good enough. He doesn't have to be Jay Wright. He just has to be himself.
What's going to be the biggest difference between Scheyer and Coach K?
Well, their demeanor's different.
Mm-hmm.
John is not. Coach K is he's pretty emotional,
Mm-hmm.
and John is not without emotion. I'm not suggesting
Mm-hmm.
that, but they're different personalities, and so similar to what I was talking about with Kyle and Kyle Neptune and Jay Wright. John's been around the block already. He's not been a head coach yet, but he's more than prepared for this. And I'm a huge believer and a huge supporter of his. He just has to, like, I don't think anybody's going to be, like, comparing the two. They'll always look to, wait a minute, they didn't do that when Coach K was there, but
Mm-hmm.
similar to what I had mentioned, like, just because Hubert Davis does it a little bit differently than Roy Williams doesn't mean, he's turning his back on Roy's way. He's just incorporating more of himself and the way he sees the game and uses his personnel. And I think it'll be the same for John. John just has to be him,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a great guy, and he's got a great way about him with players. And not only will he figure it out, he'll do extraordinarily well. But like the comparison game, places have been through this before, whether it was when John Wooden left UCLA or Bear Bryant left Alabama. I mean, you can pine for the old days all you want, but it's over.
Mm-hmm.
And the next thing, you have to kind of get on board with allowing the next guy to be him and support it and enjoy it.
It's like The Wire. The thing about the old days is they the old days.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. People pine for it, but it's over, and it's time to move forward.
Yeah, no, we see it at Tennessee all the time. Like the Heupel offense was just, it was a lot for a lot of hardcore, longtime Tennessee fans who grew up with Fulmer and just thought the defense wins champions crowd went through a tough year this year, but eventually they got on board. But it took some time to like get over the change in philosophy, which I think is moving in the right direction. But in terms of UNC, Jay, one of the things that I think is interesting because you bring up they're bringing everybody back, right? Like that's cool. It's a great story. However, what we just saw, I think, with Gonzaga and Baylor, who were still 1-2 following their season last year, where it was clear that Baylor and Gonzaga were the two best teams in college basketball a season ago. They were pretty clear the best two teams in college basketball again this year for the majority of the year. And then, of course, the tournament happens and injuries and stuff like that play a role. But ultimately, they don't get back. They don't even make the Final Four. And I wonder, with these kids, it's interesting because it's just so much more difficult than, I think, an Alabama or a Clemson running it back in college football or even in college baseball with the College World Series. But, like, it's going to be really hard. The UNC was kind of a blip, or they came out of nowhere this past year. And this is not a bunch of NBA guys who came out of nowhere last year. I think it's going to be a lot more arduous than I think a lot of people when we throw it because it's such a good story. But I don't know. I think back to Baylor and Gonzaga, who were really, really good this year, and they looked like they could go back to back. And it just shows, like, it's really hard to get there once. It's going to be even more insanely difficult for them to replicate what they did a year ago, right?
Well, yeah, but part of it was Baylor had some really significant injuries down the stretch. They lost Jonathan Chatwell for the season. Then L.J. Cryer was injured, didn't really play in the tournament, so they were compromised.
Right,
and they didn't have their full complement of players. If they did, you certainly would have favored them to reach another Final Four.
Mm-hmm.
But that's sort of the interesting part you brought up about Alabama, Clemson, and football and all that stuff. In football, they choose who their Final Four is going to be,
mm-hmm.
and basketball doesn't do that.
You still have to run the gauntlet again.
Yeah, you have to go out and earn your way there. Not that Alabama didn't earn their way to the college football playoff. I'm not suggesting that, but if basketball did it the way football did it, we would have had Kansas and Baylor and Gonzaga. And who was the other number one seed? I can't remember, but they Arizona.
Yeah.
So they all would have been in the college football playoff.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were the best teams in the regular season, but they had to go play. And in basketball, I mean, you can't just physically dominate. You can in some games if it's allowed, but you got to make shots and all that stuff. So it's more susceptible to an upset perhaps than football is.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe this: when they go to 12 in the college football playoff, you're going to see some upsets here and there, and people are they're gonna say, "Oh, we have parity now," when they probably have it right now, but we're not allowed to see it because they don't play the games. How does Texas A&M beat Alabama in the regular season, but it could never happen in a playoff? Come on, man! Of course it could.
Yeah.
Same thing in basketball, but we've got a bizarre system in basketball where you got to play 6 games to win a championship, and there's 6 single elimination games. It's an interesting way to crown a champion, and the truth is we don't always. First of all, we don't have the 68 best teams in the tournament,
mm-hmm.
but we don't. The best team doesn't always win in basketball. It's a lot harder to win. People say anybody can win this thing. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Anybody can break through in their bracket and maybe make an Elite Eight or
the St. Peter's, where it's like they can make it pretty far, but they can't finish
win
the drill.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
At least we haven't seen it yet. So I felt like there were 8 teams this year that had a chance to win it, which was a lot more than last year, to your point. But different years you have a few more teams that may be capable. Anybody can fall down and get beat, but you're not going to see all 8 of them lose. It's kind of like in a golf tournament when they're somebody's 5 strokes behind. Well, it depends on how many guys are ahead of them or how many golfers are ahead of them. If you got a long list, the chances of making up that 5-stroke difference against a long list is different than if it's just one golfer ahead of you with a 5-stroke advantage.
Was there one team that, like, it doesn't have to be KenPom, or where you saw just coworkers and other folks who also were just really well versed in the game and who was good and who wasn't, that the numbers liked and that they all backed the numbers that this team was one of the best teams in college basketball this season, but you're like, when I watch them, I don't see the same thing. I don't see the same story. Was there one team in particular that you struggled with this year where you're like, I don't get it with them?
That's a good question. I can't remember thinking that way. I mean, there were some teams you thought were a little bit, might have been a little bit overrated
Mm-hmm.
in that regard. Could they, did you really think they were a threat to win it? I was, I still think Arizona
Hmm.
was way better than a Sweet 16 team, but they ran into Houston,
Mm-hmm.
and what are you going to do? I mean, that's a powerful, powerful, tough team. But Arizona had and to your earlier question about who did you enjoy watching and all that stuff. Arizona ran great stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and they were always one pass away from a ball screen. Their offense was very similar to Gonzaga's in a lot of ways. Like their ball movement was so good. They had incredible transition. Their big guys really ran the floor to Bilas and Coloco. So I was a huge believer in them, and they were another team that had an injury. I mean, Kirk
Mm-hmm.
Risa was not healthy at the end of the year. Had he been, I think he had 2 games in a row where he's 1 for 10,
Yeah.
and had he shot the ball at his normal rate, I think would have been a Final Four team.
So I've got two questions for you from Stats by Will. I don't know if you're familiar with Stats by Will. Tom Hart, SEC Network favorite. Great. He does great college basketball insight. And he sent two questions that he wanted your perspective on. And
Okay,
if that's okay.
yeah,
All right. Number one, this latest NCAA tournament closed with the lowest 3-point percentage since the 3-point line was introduced and had the second lowest field goal percentage as well. As someone who played the game and watches more basketball than almost anyone, do you feel that that's due to quality defense, poor shot selection, the new ball, or something else?
I think it was due to the physicality of the game.
Hmm.
That the game, and look, the NCAA supervisor of officials differs with me on this and
Mm-hmm.
has said so both publicly and privately. But I think it's undeniable that the game became way more physical this year relative to the last several. And if you look at scoring, we had the lowest scoring Sweet 16 since 2015, and that's when we really made a lot of movement. Made a concerted effort for freedom of movement
Mm-hmm.
and calling the game and the rules as written. We didn't change any rules, but we enforced the rules more vigilantly, and we saw scoring go up without a significant uptick in fouls or free throws. But this year we saw fouls actually go down, fouls called. Where fouls committed, I believe, were way up.
Mm-hmm.
Fouls called were way down, and it did not come with a some sort of corresponding jump in 3-point attempts. That means, well, they took a bunch of threes, therefore they weren't getting fouled. We have a penetrate and pitch game, and it's more of a spread game than it has been in the past. But I think so. We had the lowest scoring Sweet 16 in the Elite Eight. Only 2 teams of the 8 Elite Eight teams hit 70 points. Only
Hmm.
2. 4 of the Elite Eight teams scored 50 or fewer in their Elite Eight games. I mean, half of the Elite Eight scored 50 points or fewer, which includes Villanova and Houston playing a 50-44 game.
Yeah.
50-44. And look, I get it. Like it's just one data point, so I'm not
Mm-hmm.
suggesting that. But when you have that that those sort of numbers from the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight, I think sometimes we had a great game in the Final Four with Duke and North Carolina, but when is that game not great?
Yeah.
And sometimes that can mask the overall. And so I believe, and look, reasonable minds can differ on this. I'm always willing to listen to the opposing view of this, and I'm putting it out there that the NCAA supervisor disagrees. We have served on the same competition committee for several years, and he's adamant that the game's no different this year than it was in past years. But I don't agree with that. But I would say that that's the primary reason. We've seen more off ball clutching and grabbing and
Mm-hmm.
chucking of cutters, things like that. More physical on the ball, and more arm bars on ball handlers, things like that. That had been called in past years that I don't think was called the same. Not every time, but I don't think it was called the same way this year. I don't blame the officials for that. They're doing the best they can. But their bosses, the supervisors, have to take some responsibility for that. Um, but I would challenge, like I'll sit down and watch film with anybody and show them what I'm talking about, and I think it's undeniable. But now where it goes in the future, we'll see. I'm starting to think that because there's so little movement in some of the rules changes that I think need to happen, it's pretty clear we're never going to change the charge block rule,
Hmm.
and until we do, it's going to be, in my view, too big a part of the game. But there's no movement. The NCAA supervisor says he can't teach the different rule, the NBA rule of a secondary defender having to be in place and set on the
Hmm.
gather or the upward motion of the offensive player. And heck, if they can't teach it, I'm okay. But they can do it in the NBA. I don't see how that's. I mean, I can't say I disagree because I'm not out there teaching it, but
Hmm.
it defies my own logic to believe that it just can't happen. So there are a lot of barriers to changes in the game that I think would make the game better, but that's sort of the system we have.
Did the majority of fans and in your mentions and readers and people you talked to though, did they prefer the way the game was called this year, or do you think there was more pushback to the game being called differently?
Well, I mean, I don't. It depends on the level of sophistication of the fan. Like,
Hmm.
so most fans would say, well, I don't like a game where a lot of fouls are called. Well,
Hmm.
neither do I. I mean, but I don't like it when there are a lot of players stepping out of bounds. But it doesn't mean you don't call it when they step out of bounds.
Right.
Player steps out of bounds. We don't go, well, he just barely stepped out of bounds. We say, quit stepping out of bounds.
Hmm.
And when guys commit fouls, when players commit fouls, we should call it, and they'll foul less. I use the analogy of speeding on the highway.
Hmm.
That if the speed limit is 65, and like, I'm not asking for cops to hand out tickets when people are going 67 or 68 into
Hmm.
65, but when they're going 80, you need to ticket that. And if you ticket that, people will slow down. That's
Hmm.
my belief and experience. And I think it's that analogy is apt for basketball. In football, and this may not be completely accurate, but it's just a feeling I have. When an official throws a flag in a football game, calls holding. My sense is that fans aren't going, "Oh my God, quit calling holding." They're going, "Stop holding."
Hmm.
They're going, "Our team is undisciplined. They're getting too many penalties."
Hmm.
And it's the same thing in basketball. Like, not every player is good enough, talented enough, athletic enough to guard every other player.
Yeah.
And so if you can't guard them, then you're going to have to bring a double,
Hmm.
or you're going to have to play. You're going to have to do something to disrupt without doing it. You can't just physically impede
Hmm.
because it's illegal to do that. But I think too much of that has been allowed. And again, it's not every game. It's not. The games are still good. Nothing ruins the game. Nothing makes it unwatchable. I'm not
Hmm.
one of those guys, but it would certainly be better. Like, I don't think there would have been a lot of cards and letters complaining if scoring was the highest it's ever been in the NCAA tournament this year. But the fact that it was the lowest since 2015 in the sweets, at least in the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight, that should be a red flag and concerning. Doesn't mean we have to, storm the offices of the NCAA with torches and pitchforks to get action. But I think that those in charge need to be concerned about it.
The second question from Will. What returning player do you feel you're higher on than the consensus, i.e., a guy you feel is a legit All American candidate that no one is actively talking about?
Wow. Um, I don't know. I'll have to think about that one. The game's so different now. Like, I'm in the mode right now of watching which players are declaring for the draft.
Hmm.
And so, like that's why I kind of laughed. You put out after the Final Four, we put out a way too early top 25 or top
Hmm.
10. I think I did for next year. And I had thought, well, a number of these Carolina players are going to leave. Like Brady Manick obviously can't come back, but a number of these guys are going to leave, and
Hmm.
they all came back. So I mean, I would probably put them preseason number one. I do think the one thing that surprised me a little bit this year was Armando Bacot had not only an All America season, he had a historic ACC season.
Hmm.
I mean, he averaged like 14 and a half rebounds in conference. And, he had, I can't remember what it was, 31 or 32 double doubles on the season after having won in the championship game. And that's a record at North Carolina in the ACC. I mean, that's more than Tim Duncan had at Wake Forest
Hmm.
his last year. I mean, that was a stunning thing, and I was a little bit surprised. I was surprised he didn't win ACC Player of the Year. Alondas Williams from Wake Forest did, and very deserving. But I thought Baycott would get it, and I'll be interested to see if he, is first team All American going into next year, because I think he's going to be every bit as productive next year as he was this year. He's just a relentless workhorse. I mean, that kind of productivity, you don't just have a good month and do that. That
Hmm.
guy was consistently excellent all year long, and there's no reason to believe he won't be that and more next year.
We'll end on this. I watched every Tennessee game. I have my own perspective, but based on what you saw and how the season ultimately ended, did you feel like this season could have been different? It's just funny when you were talking about the defense and just letting things go and the physicality this year and the low scoring. That was, I think, the impetus for so many Tennessee fans. Like, if we're gonna do this in the Rick Barnes era, this is the year to do it. Where it seems like we have mastered the muck it up ball. Like, we're gonna bring you into the mud, and you're gonna like it. You're gonna deal with it, and we're gonna see what happens. And for me, I mean, we don't have to get into like why Tennessee was probably underseeded in the tournament, but it did feel different this year in Knoxville, and this team really did figure it out, especially after Kumwa unfortunately went down. Was just that like Barnes was able to kind of shore up his big man rotation and kind of figured out who he could rely on and who he couldn't, and it worked. Zakai was comfortable as the sixth man. Like, you just looked at the four guards with James at the four, and you're like, okay, they have the versatility. They can go big if they need to. They can go small if they need to. This collection of young talent, veterans, like this is it. Like, this is everything seems to be coalescing the right way for Coach Barnes, and obviously the first SEC tourney win in decades. But it obviously they ran into just Dickinson losing his mind in the Michigan game, where it's like of all the times, like that was the game we needed Kumwa for. Was like that particular moment. It's like you wish you could just bring him back. It's like, all right, we need you on Dickinson here, and then by the way, we got to go back to what we were doing before that, but we just need you right here. I don't know. It's gonna sting, and I think it's still sitting with a lot of Tennessee fans. Like, this was a really really tough tournament loss, and it felt different this year in Knoxville.
Yeah, and that when you have that great of a season and win
Hmm.
your conference championship, and
Undefeated at home.
yeah, and especially after I did the game where Tennessee went to Kentucky and got their doors blown off.
Hmm.
I think they were down by 30 during the game, if I remember right.
We don't have to go into that one.
And
That was the
well,
Kentucky. They shot like 80%
no,
from
they
the
played
field goal.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah, they played great.
insane.
But Tennessee didn't let it define them. A
Hmm.
lot of times that can be a shock to the system where you don't really recover from it. And not only did they recover, they beat Kentucky after that and hammered them pretty good in
Hmm.
Knoxville. And that SEC tournament win was eye opening. I did after like I had Tennessee against Texas Tech in the Garden when
Hmm.
they had to repaint the rims after that game. There were so many missed shots, and still they had a chance to win. But you always kind of wonder, are they one bad shooting night away from a loss? But that's true of a lot of teams.
Hmm.
But I thought they were fully capable of a Final Four, but they were like a number of other teams that were just outside the very top tier, and meaning they could get beat by a number of teams. and they ran into one of them in Michigan. But similar to like the SEC, I thought was the best league in the country,
Hmm.
and they had one team make it to what is it? One team to the Sweet 16
Yep.
in Arkansas, and they wound up in the Elite Eight before they lost to Duke. But I don't know how to process that. Was it just I know what the analytics in our eyes told us about what the SEC did during the regular season. It's just tough to reconcile, kind of like the Big Ten did last year. They were the best league last year and then laid an egg in the tournament
Hmm.
as a league, and that's what happened to the SEC this year. I just don't think it was representative of how good they were overall. So I don't know how to process that one, but I'm not worried about, you know, I mean, for Tennessee, they're one of those programs that you know you don't have a shot every year.
Hmm.
Like maybe Duke or Carolina or some of these places they can legitimately have a shot every year. Gonzaga has a shot every year to do something special. It doesn't feel like Tennessee's had that over the years,
Hmm.
but I think they've established a program now where they're going to have a shot more often than ever. And I've always been a big believer in Rick Barnes. He's one of the great guys and one of the truly outstanding coaches. So I don't doubt they'll be competitive year in and year out.
Absolutely. We'll end on this, Coach. Your favorite, like college basketball's over. You've got time. Players are still declaring. We are still figuring out. LSU still got to find like 10 more guys to fill out their roster for this fall. Shout out to Miss Oak Ridge's own Coach McMahon there. But what do you do? What is your getaway? How do you recharge your batteries after running the gauntlet in the spring? What do you do? Is it just golf, or do you dive into a lot of books that you've been wanting to read? What do you do?
Yeah, I have been diving into, some catching up on, things that I've missed, a little binge watching a few things.
Hmm.
I hang out a lot with my wife. We've had a lot of things that piled up from the season that we pushed to April.
Hmm.
And sometimes you got to be a little careful with that. You tell people, "Hey, we'll do that in April." So book that in April. And then you wind up having your whole April filled with obligations
Yeah.
that are back to back to back. And I did a little bit of that. Had my 30th law school reunion we attended. So I was running around a fair amount. But I play a lot of golf with my friends because I like to be outside. I really enjoy playing and trying to catch up with family. So there's a lot of that. But then we'll get back into the routine of the draft, the NBA draft coming up. But I try to get. I went to the Masters and
Oh,
um, so I'm trying to do stuff like that
yeah.
just to recharge a little bit and be a fan and enjoy myself that way.
How was that? Did you get to see Tiger up close? Like, how was your Masters experience?
It was great. I've been a bunch
Mm,
before. I only live 2 hours away from Augusta. I live in Charlotte,
nice.
North Carolina, so it's a pretty easy trip. And it's fun. For me, the Masters is more of a social event. Like you don't get to see as much golf as you think.
Mm,
But for me, being 6'7", I can see over the top of most of the gallery, so I don't have to worry. I only saw Tiger for a hole because we didn't want to fight the crowd following him
yeah.
around on Thursday. So I saw him tee off at 11, and he looked really good, and that was fun. So we hung around, 10 and 18, watched tee shots at 1, and then went to Amen Corner and saw tee shots on 12, which is always really cool. And then watching some of the tee shots come down 13. But just walking that property, how beautiful it is, how hilly, and the topography is incredible. And then like the Masters to me is a almost you might say the NCAA could learn something from that. Like if if the NCAA put its values where its rhetoric is and did things like they wouldn't have as many commercials during the games, and they would limit the they wouldn't charge as much for food and all this stuff. They'd make it a better experience. But money's important. Money's clearly not the driving force for Augusta National Golf Club.
Mm,
It's $3 for a chicken sandwich, and I don't even remember what it was for a beer. But I mean, you're going, really? That's all it was? No, we had all this, and they're going, no,
mm,
that's all it costs. Um, it's just a wonderful experience, and everybody's well behaved, and It's a pleasure to be there. But I just love going there. It's a blast.
There you go. Jay, is there anything we can check out coming from you in the not too distant future on ESPN.com? Anything on the podcast front? What can we plug here as we wrap up?
We're still doing Bald Men on Campus.
Mm-hmm.
We had Tom Izzo and Leonard Hamilton today, Seth Greenberg, Alfonso Ellis, and I. So we hashed through NIL and the transfer portal and all the difficulties that are going on in the game. But I'm hoping. Well, I know we're going to do this. We're going to be focusing on all the good stuff coming up. The idea that so many of these players are coming back, and there's a lot to celebrate in the game, and we're looking forward to that part of it.
There you go. Jay, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time this evening. I greatly appreciate it. Good luck the rest of the way, and we'll have to check back in again soon.
Look forward to it. Thanks.